Lucy, good morning. This is Emlyn Koster. I'm speaking from Raleigh, North Carolina in the United States, and it's a pleasure to both join the board and participate in this symposium. Are my slides up? Can you see them?
Not yet.
Yes, I see the Earth System Great Acceleration Anthropocene.
That's it?
The PDF.
But I don't.
Yes.
So Heath, what do I do to get that on the full screen for everybody?
I see it. Does everybody else see Emlyn's?
I take it back. I had to move something. Okay.
Okay.
Thumbs up
right.
if you can see Emlyn's talk, everyone. Thank you. All right, you're on.
Very much. So I am going to speak about the last nanosecond of geological history, the 4.5 billion year history of the solar system and of the planet, but only the last 70 years of that immense period, which is to say that I am speaking over the next 35 or so minutes about the 8th threshold in David Christian's origin story, named the Anthropocene, meaning the period of anthro, of humans. This is something which has occupied my attention now for the last 10 years, and I draw to your attention in case these seminal publications, some of the most multi-authored papers in the world ever, have drawn attention to what the world scientific community, including the vast majority of Nobel laureates, have said are warnings to humanity. They've been buoyed in these efforts by the Union of Concerned Scientists. And as you see, this has been put to society, not necessarily with great media attention, I might add, since 1992. And then they resumed this calling in 2017 when an incredible 15,000 plus scientists signed the paper in Bioscience, and it's continued last year. So this is sort of the backdrop to the problem we face, a warning to humanity. I come at this from a background both as a geologist working in the field, but also a decision back in the mid-80s to try to cause museums that I might have the chance to be at the helm of to direct their attention to a better public understanding, a better public grasp of what was emerging as a massive concern, which has only exponentially increased since that time. And here are just thumbnails of the 4 museums of which I've had the pleasure to be at the helm in Alberta, Ontario, Canada, and in the New York, New Jersey region, and in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I'm speaking to you now. The museum field has, I would say, been slow to shift its sense of relevance from the past to the present, and only just beginning to shift it to the future. Of course, we can't collect the future, so one of the traditional major tools in the toolkit of museums, nature and science museums, and even art museums, unless it's being imagined, have been to focus on the past. But back in 2012, the Smithsonian, the National Museum of Natural History, hosted a National Science Foundation sponsored 2-day convening, which I then wrote about in a paper called Natural History, Past, Present, and Future. And from the declaration from that 2-day event is this quote below, that we have the urgent responsibility to give voice to the Earth's immense story. And lower down at the end of the declaration, we are at a critical moment in the continuity of time. So this is my wake-up call, and I want to just pick up a chronology starting just over 70 years ago. One of the great astronomers, I understand, and this is not my field, but my understanding from the literature is that associated with the Big Bang is the British astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle, who said this remarkably prescient statement back in 1948, that once a photograph of the Earth taken from the outside is available, a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose. He could not have known, in fact, I think it was after his death, that it would be 21 years later that NASA's program would put astronauts on the moon, with the great phrase, "one giant step for humankind." It was only 1 year later that the Earth's humanity responded with a concern that despite this beautiful, pristine view of the planet from 250,000 miles away, that down here on planet Earth, there was a growing concern that we were not taking care of this planet with its wafer-thin atmosphere that you can't even see from the moon. And so there's a front cover of the New York Times showing millions join Earth Day observations across the globe. So I am now at university during this 69-70 period. In fact, I'm just about to graduate at the University of Sheffield in geology. And so I've kind of lived the history that I'm going to tell you about. I'll pick up and just introduce, in case you're not familiar with it, this term Earth system. So again, speaking as a geologist, for some time, for many decades, there's been this understanding. It was in the Gaia hypothesis. It was in many other seminal works back in the second half of the 20th century and maybe before, that if we take all of the shells of the Earth, all the enveloping layers, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and so on, that these together form as it says here, a self-regulating, interactive, physical, a set of processes which are physical, chemical, and biological. The famous biologist who was married briefly to Carl Sagan and who wrote some powerful things about sort of global biology, Lynn Margulis, who I thank Lucy for introducing me to, talked about the Earth system as one giant ecosystem, which I think is very appropriate because life, wherever it exists in that Earth system, is interconnected with everything else, which turns out to be a really essential point for where we are in the history of the world right now, in big history. I'll add to this sequence that 5 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation, based in New York City, and the medical journal The Lancet did a joint commission on what they call planetary health, this planet, Earth. And their conclusion was that the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends defines planetary health. So we have this inseparability between things that we often treat separately or disconnected or not even in our radar screen. We're very consumed with being human these days, with all of our problems, which I'll come back to, but we often feel very detached from the natural systems from which we came and on which we depend. In this chronology recap, I put into the sequence the UN Sustainable Development Goals, although I'm going to be rather respectfully dismissive, if that's not an oxymoron, in a moment. But I remember the UN conference in the mid-80s with the justifiable renown of the Scandinavian Minister for the Environment, Madame Brundtland, who gave rise to this term Sustainable Development Goals. The idea that, well, two things were being developed, two concepts really. One was that there is this notion, which she maintained in her belief at the time, mid-80s. We didn't know very much as we know now today, but sustainable was a thought that she had that we could use resources at a lower level than we were to safeguard their availability for future generations. In other words, we're not robbing from the future. And that if we had this concept of sustainability, that we could continue development on a sustainable premise. So there was born the 17 goals of the UN's 2015 program, and it has an agenda of trying to complete success against the 169 goals, sorry, the 17 goals with their 169 targets by 2030. That may be good news, but the bad news is that only a handful of these have so far been accomplished. And so, and we've turned out to understand that while sustainability is a powerful word, and certainly it applies to recycling and energy preservation and renewable energy and non-use of fossil fuels and so on, what we have already destroyed, we cannot reverse and recover. We cannot bring back extinct species. we likely cannot recool the atmosphere, therefore we cannot stop sea level rise, and so on. So I'm going to respectfully suggest that this is beginning to wane as a concept, while sustainability locally and regionally is a very powerful concept, but all of our efforts do not add up to sustaining the planet as it was in its pre-human state. So enter the Anthropocene, and some people like to pronounce this as Anthropocene, but think of it as anthropology in the pronunciation. So on the left, you have the Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen, who in 2000, and then in a paper in Nature, which is inserted there, the one-page paper, as all Nature papers are, The Geology of Mankind, in 2002, this was a seminal paper, one of the most referenced papers now in all of the geological sciences. He was then the vice chair of what was then called the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which has now been superseded by the international group called Future Earth. But the first chair of the Anthropocene Working Group, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute, said this phrase on the right, that the Anthropocene represents a new phase in both humankind and of the Earth, when natural forces and human forces become intertwined, so that the future of one determines the fate, not the future, but the fate of the other. So this is Jan Zelasevic and his colleagues, including Paul Crutzen, who works at the University of Leicester in the UK. So we go on, and this concept of thinking that the human world and the natural world are in fact intertwined is not a new concept. The famous German explorer Alexander von Humboldt, living over the late 1700s, early 1800s, his contributions to the progress of science, even though it was before its time, was written up in a beautiful paper in the journal Science, the journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, called Humboldt's Fusion of Science and Humanism. And so leaping forward a little bit, I'm going to say now that this term for me is very powerful and needs to be better known both in scientific and non-scientific circles as well as in public circles, because it has these properties that I list here. It's an encompassing or holistic term. It refers to all species, both human and non-human. It encompasses the whole Earth. It straddles the geological past, geological present, and geological future, as well as all of historic and prehistoric time. It is transdisciplinary, which is what we have to do these days, I believe. And I distinguish that from transsector. Transdisciplinary referring to all of the disciplines of an academic institution, but transsector going into non-academic sectors as well. And so let's just sort of park that in our minds and say that this term Anthropocene, having been coined in 2002 officially in the literature by Paul Crutzen in Nature, by 2007 we have a Anthropocene working group that's formed, which is a subgroup of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is that branch of geology that looks at the layering of rocks and their origins, stratification, strata, and so on. And that in turn is a constituent body of the IUGS, the International Union of Geological Sciences, which is the worldwide authority. And we have Libby Robin, Australian National University, who is leaping forward and saying that the task of reconceptualizing planetary change for the human imagination calls for a wide range of interdisciplinary or disciplinary wisdom. You're not intended to see any of the details of these graphs, except that they all have the same shape, and they all run across the x-axis from the early 20th century to now. They all have this exponential climb that accelerates through the mid-20th century. On the left are 16 socioeconomic trends, on the right are 16 Earth system trends, and collectively they're called the Great Acceleration. This is our problem, and it wouldn't be until 2000 that the Great Acceleration would be then seen in Anthropocene terms. So here's sort of the detail here. Will Stephan, who is a colleague of David Christian, in Australia. He's a colleague of Libby Robin, whom I just cited, and he's at Australian National University. If I may just read this, it says, of all the candidates for a start date of the Anthropocene, the beginning of the Great Acceleration is by far the most convincing from an Earth system science perspective. So he's saying, let's take a whole Earth system perspective. It is only beyond the mid-20th century that there is clear evidence for fundamental shifts in the state and functioning of the Earth system that are beyond the range of variability of the Holocene, which is the last named epoch so far in the geological timescale, and driven by human activities and not by natural variability. So this is sort of putting the nail on the head as far as how Earth system thinking is required in order for us to understand the Great Acceleration, which in turn has become so accelerating that it now needs to be defined, as I have just done in papers which I sent to the board yesterday. For me, the Anthropocene recognizes humanity as the dominant species of all biodiversity, which in a geological nanosecond, the phrase I used on the first slide, has extensively detached itself from the Earth system, endangering the future of both. So the Earth system then comprises not 5, I'm going to add one that's very anthropogenic, the Humano Sphere. But I'm going to just touch on each of these with these sort of iconic, lovely looking photos. There's an insert in the Cryosphere which looks at tundra or permafrost, because part of the definition, of course, of the Cryosphere, meaning the frozen sphere, is not just ice sheets, ice caps and glaciers, but frozen ground, as we have, unfortunately, in a diminishing amount across northern Asia, northern Russia, Siberia, and northern Canada and north slope of Alaska. But let's just then delve into each of these briefly and say that the atmosphere, which of course is the lower, we're talking primarily about the lowermost layer of it, up to the level that jet planes fly, and below which all living things exist. The anthropogenic impacts that we're having on the atmosphere are summarized below. The warming of the atmosphere, which gets the most news, its pollution, its change in dynamics, such that we're seeing changing frequencies of extreme weather with very damaging, potentially catastrophic events in the weather. Weather, of course, being just today's brief moment in the longer history of climate, and then also the averages of how long the seasons are. If we look at the hydrosphere, which oceans are 71% of the Earth's surface, and this contains all lakes, oceans, and rivers. We have, again, unfortunately, widespread pollution, and now there's ubiquitous plastic debris all through not only the land environments, but also in the ocean, down to microscopic levels. We see whales being beached with their bellies full of plastic bottles. The ocean is warming and weather is intensifying. The Antarctic is getting smaller. The Arctic sea ice is largely disappearing. And the biggest consequence is sea level rise, as well as shifts in altitude and latitude of ecosystems on land and in the sea. The cryosphere, we're seeing, of course, rapidly, by the end of this century, likely most glaciers will have disappeared. And this is not just of idle passing. This is crucial for areas in Piedmont areas that depend on the water in the rivers coming from melting ice, and many other effects that we're having as well. Just to break into the interconnection between the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, this was the front cover of a special issue of National Geographic in 2017 with the 7 things you need to know about climate change now. Well, the now was 3 years ago, and it's pretty obvious what's happening on the right. The bigger consequence is that, and it's not going to happen, fortunately, in our lifetime, but it doesn't need to, just 2 feet, 6 feet, 10 feet, or 3 meters of sea level rise will be catastrophic for the large percentage of the world's population that lives in cities or non-cities at or near sea level. And so if all of Antarctica was to melt, that would be a 200-foot rise in global sea level. If only Greenland does it, and they won't be separate, that'll be a 20-foot rise in sea level. if there's any good news, I insert that little diagram below of Scandinavia, which reminds us that because of the last ice age, during which most of this ice extended way out and lowered sea level by as much as 200 feet. Fortunately, we're living in a larger continental area mode right now. I'm sorry, a smaller. Sea level has regressed, land has gotten smaller, but where the ice was at its maximum thickness, by some estimates up to 2 miles thick, like across Hudson Bay in North America and across Scandinavia, those contours show the amount of land that was depressed and which is now rising, as geologists say, isostatically. So if you want to move to a safe place where the climate's getting better, move to Hudson Bay if you can cope with the polar bears, which are getting less, or move to the Baltic region of Scandinavia, where the land is still way away from any rising sea level, because the land is rising quicker than sea level is rising. An interesting factoid for you. The lithosphere, which I show sort of a few thousand feet maybe in a massive mine, and the topmost part of the lithosphere, which is crucial to agriculture, the pedosphere, we're doing a lot of damage to this layer of the Earth too, as is listed here. And the biosphere, which is gets maybe most news, the sphere of life, looking up at a pristine forest. I'm afraid the bad news is here too, as we list below. Massive amounts of the biosphere have already been destroyed or compromised by human activity, by anthropogenic effects. And just one example, we probably all know of the iconic book Silent Spring in the mid-60s by Rachel Carson, about how extensive pesticides and insecticides were going to cause no songbirds to be in spring. Well, we haven't exactly stopped that problem yet due to food chain interruption and ecosystem declines. As the New York Times reported just last September, the number of birds, for example, in the US and Canada has declined by almost 1/3 over the past half century. So we continue to do massive damage, and this is just one example. So we come to the Humano Sphere, which has not traditionally been one of those enveloping named parts of the Earth system. Hugh Roberts, in an article on Earth Day this year, talked about the human civilization being estranged from planet Earth. What we have as a problem, in summary, is the world is dominated by a non or unecological attitude, which is much more about me and now rather than us and future. This has to be curbed, otherwise we're just going to cause there to be a further acceleration of the Great Acceleration and a worsening of the anthropogenic effect. Geologists have now begun to name the most surface layer of the Earth's crust as the Archaeosphere, meaning the layer above the youngest natural deposits, pre-human, in which all of human civilization is recorded, whether that's plastic debris or whether that's remains of civilizations or mines and excavations and so on. And it's led to the escalation, as I'll end my talk with in a few minutes, on what we now call existential crises, or at least we use that word in another sense. So to be reminded of the damage, and not to be depressing, but here we have bleached coral from two oceans that are too warm. We have forests which are being deforested. We have oil pollution in the ocean. That's the great oil rig that collapsed in the Gulf about 5 years ago. And we have beaches that look like this in the lower right. Of course, it's not just our damage to this. There is increasingly damage that's caused by nature because we live too close to sea level and build too close to sea level. And today, as I speak, a possible hurricane force 1, maybe just a tropical storm, is going to bring apparently up to 4 feet or a meter of storm surge to the coastline, fortunately, that I'm away from, which will impact South Carolina and North Carolina. It's happening today. But these are images of Hurricane Katrina in New York, Hurricane Sandy, which wasn't even a full-fledged hurricane, and the New Jersey coast, and in the lower left, Katrina as it came ashore in New Orleans with the extent of that cyclone coming up maybe that's the one that's coming now to North America, up the East Coast now. So these are things that we need to see in context. So actually, I'm going to end with this slide, 2 slides. If we just sort of focus on the upper part and go back to late 2019, even before the pandemic in 2020, one heard about the term existential crisis. Frankly, I hadn't heard too much about it, and I went to the dictionary. And in this case, I'm quoting you from the Medical News Today website. And when it's applied to individual, any one of us, it means, as it says here, a moment of deep questioning about oneself, within oneself. It usually relates to how someone sees themselves and their purpose within the world. And actually, I can't find a definition that is not at the individual scale. And yet, as soon as the pandemic started, this word was being used at the whole society level. And in the US at least, and I think elsewhere in the world, it's now being applied additionally to the racial reckoning, the systemic racism, which the murder of the African American in Minneapolis on May 25th has brought about. So I now sort of see that the Earth system is got multiple concurrent existential crises, which I will define in this case as accelerating or sudden. Accelerating might be illustrated by climate change and sea level rise, sudden by the pandemic, which wasn't there and then it was there. They're preoccupying and they dominate the news and they destabilize all social and environmental norms. I don't think it's possible to think about any aspect of living or livelihood or the near future which is not affected by some combination of the existential crises which are impacting the Earth system. And I will say it's not just the ones I've mentioned. I think in the US, we have a constitutional crisis, we have a leadership crisis, and we have multiple other crises which are happening, which are making all these worse. And so we come to my last slide, which is to bring to our attention, if I may, the term empathy, which, like existential crisis, has been traditionally referred to only in human terms, that we feel so close to somebody else and their issues that we have an empathetic stance. It's linked with compassion, but we don't get compassion unless we have a preoccupation with feeling empathetically. Well, as I have been saying over the last year in various talks, I don't believe this is just at the individual human scale either. The upper left icon is from the amazing traveling exhibit called Race, Are We So Different? ? About the fact that 99.5% of human DNA is all the same. We are only different by appearance. We are not different by biology, other than half of 1%, which is trivial. And yet we make such a big deal about it to the point where we shoot one another and go to wars over this. This is ridiculous, stupid, despicable activity. That's human to human empathy, which we lack. Jane Goodall, in that famous moment in the 60s in Gombe, when she reached out after being patient to develop a relationship with chimpanzees, when they touched their fingers, was maybe a first moment when we realized that non-human life is also sentient. And so human to non-human empathy is equally important, in my view, inseparable from human to human. And then as we look thirdly and lastly into the eye of an African elephant, which are being killed at the rate of about 1 every 20 seconds, we see a reminder of looking into the environment and how we must be empathetic to every other component, non-human and human, in the environment. And so for me, the story of the Earth system, which has now reached sort of climactic proportions in the Great Acceleration, which has further exacerbated into the Anthropocene, now needs unprecedented amounts of human attention that bring in empathy. And with that, I end the presentation and thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
We can take questions. We have 5 minutes. Okay, Peter Whitehouse.
So thank you, Emlyn. I think you and I last saw each other at the ISCOM Natch Hist meeting in Pittsburgh.
Indeed.
We had a chapter with Eric Griswold, the director of that Natural History Museum, on the future of natural history museums. And I think Pittsburgh had the first director or curator of the Anthropocene. So what's happened? Natural history museums were kind of in some kind of revolution. So where do you see those museums, and particularly as an academic, their relationships to universities as part of this process of educating going forward?
Well, thank you, Peter. Yes, I remember, and hope we connect again in person. That was a pioneering meeting. The exhibition that the Carnegie Museum of Natural History had called Humans in Nature, I believe, was not the first. The Deutsche Museum in Munich had Welcome to the Anthropocene a few years earlier. But to your question, I have lamented that universities, like perhaps you all feel about big history, it's an encompassing, non-discipline specific undertaking. But I will cite as maybe an exemplar of what I hope are the things to come. At the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, in the United States, I gather from the website that human ecology is a compulsory course for every student that goes to College of the Atlantic. And there is a course called the Anthropocene, which is a mandatory course as part of the sort of compulsory curriculum in human ecology. It's still rare. I am affiliated with North Carolina State University. I'm an adjunct professor in the Department of Marine Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. And whether I go to that university or my alma mater, the University of Ottawa in Canada, what I hear is that there's so much pressure to maintain the traditional disciplines and to have difficulty in transgressing across those discipline boundaries, as David Christian has recently written, that I can only hope, as I'm sure all of you do, in the same vein as big history, that we sort of get the message that we have to blur these boundaries and get students sort of inclined into much more of a transdisciplinary space. So there's my short answer to your important question, if I may.
Thank you both. Anybody else? We've got 3 minutes. Claudio.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. So thank you very much, Emily. I really appreciate your talk. And there was one word that you mentioned at the beginning, that is the word exponential increase, acceleration. Well, this is precisely what I think as well. And let me please stress that exponential is a mathematical way of writing developments of things. And, you know, if you're looking for a stochastic process that is a fluctuating function that has an exponential mean value, that is called in physics geometric Brownian motion or exponential Brownian motion. So the point I would like to say is that I have been working on this, precisely on this stochastic process for about 10 years, and there is a book coming out, they are printing it now, and the title is Evo-SETI. Evo, of course, stands for evolution, and SETI stands for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So the conclusion is that when the book is out, if you could find some time to have a look, I think that you and I share precisely the same ideas about the accelerating rate of everything, as you showed with many diagrams in the last 70 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudio. And I think that the term exponential, I will look for that book. As we start to communicate this out to the public, I think the word exponential is a bit daunting. It's very jargony. And I think this is maybe a bit of a Canadian metaphor, or any country that plays ice hockey. But the other way I see it being referred to, exponential is like a hockey stick. It starts off low and then shoots straight up. And so I've seen these trends referred to as hockey stick-like trends. And maybe to the degree to which North Americans understand the shape of a hockey stick or a lacrosse stick, they can understand what these trends look like as a graph. but I'll look out for your book. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you.
All right, it is 9:40 on the dot. And that is time to shift. This is going fantastically. I will say, just because I'm taking notes of what can big history do, perhaps we should develop a curriculum for human ecology that we make available and write about the importance that every student graduating from college needs to understand human ecology.
So I urge you to have a look, Lucy and everybody, at the College of the Atlantic, so-called, in Bar Harbor, Maine, to see the curriculum and the Anthropocene course, which is co-taught by a geologist and an anthropologist.
They're leaders in this.
Yeah.
All right.